confused about
yeah.
Great.
Heiwai, we are going to record. Is that okay with you?
No worry at all. I was confused about the time because.
Okay, and you are the new director of Asia Global Fellows program, which I'm very happy to be a fellow, and so I'm happy to meet you as well for the first time online. Obviously, you have an amazing track record as also professor of Johns Hopkins. You are a research fellow of many other global economic studies institute in Germany. You have consulted with important organizations like the World Bank, the United Nations, the Asia Development Bank. So I really think that you bring an amazing level of knowledge of China, of Asia, but also important global dynamics. And we are looking forward to listen to your presentation. And thank you so much in advance, Heiwai. Please introduce yourself, because I know I'm not introducing yourself properly. So please add anything about your career or your experience that you think is useful to know before you start.
No, thank you so much, Cecilia. You did a great job introducing me already, and I don't want to waste more time talking about my past and my career path. But as Cecilia said, I'm very happy to be here, and I was working as an economist in different universities for almost 15 years. You know, I got my PhD from MIT in 2008. Since then, I've been a professor in economics, first at Tufts University in Massachusetts, and then at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, DC. 2 years ago, I decided to come back to my hometown, Hong Kong, and I have become a full professor in economics, as well as the associate director of Asia Global Institute. As Cecilia may have told you, the Asia Global Institute is really an academic think tank, and what we have been doing here at the University of Hong Kong is trying to provide some alternative perspectives based in Asia to shed some light about global affairs, foreign policies, as well as geopolitical situations around the world. As Cecilia has suggested me to speak about today, it's half about the Chinese economy and the other half about the relationship between China and the rest of the world. And I understand that there's a short course on South-South cooperation, so I would try to focus more on China's relationships with other emerging markets. I have to say, my expertise is on Asia. I know relatively less about your continent, and Cecilia has kindly said that don't worry about it because there are the Latin American experts who are going to share the insights with you later today and tomorrow, so I'm going to focus mostly on Asia. I have to say I miss Brazil a lot. I was in São Paulo, I think 3 years ago, and I had a fascinating time, enjoying the conversations with your fellow Brazilian economists, as well as enjoying obviously the food and the culture. All right, so can you see the slides? I tried to remove this bar so that you can see more. I actually high floating meeting control. Yes, now it's better. All right. So I'm going to spend, if you don't mind, about half an hour going through some slides, and I'm happy to have more interactions with you during the Q&A session. And please ask me any questions related to the slides, but also related to China, as well as the entire continent in Asia. So I'm going to talk about the emergence of China in a hyper-globalization period from the early 90s all the way to 2008. And I'm going to convince you that the world has actually been deglobalizing since 2009, right after the global financial crisis. So the deglobalization period didn't start because of Donald Trump or because of all these anti-globalization sentiment and events that happened in the last few years. There have been some structural changes in the global economy, as well as changing sentiment, as you must be fully aware of, related to the rise of nationalism and populism, which are obviously not too pro-globalizing in the last few years. And then I'm going to shift gear to talk about the Chinese economy, specifically about the recent 5-year plan under the current president of China, Xi Jinping. And because there are lots of content coming out in the two-session meeting in March this year. So I'm going to focus more on the so-called dual circulation, which is composed of two parts. One part is about internal circulation, and the second part is about external circulation. Briefly speaking, internal circulation is about how the Chinese government is thinking about consolidating and strengthening domestic supply chains, at the same time trying to provide some more support, both financial support as well as policy support to increase domestic demand. That said, it doesn't mean that China is giving up globalization. It has its own multilateralism, multilateral organizations that it is trying to foster in order to build its own resilient regional supply chains. And along those lines, I'm going to talk about RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which I'm sure you have heard about. And then towards the end, I will talk about the famous Belt and Road initiatives, which have obviously arose quite a lot of anxiety around the world, both in the host countries of the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as in non-member countries. And if I still have time, I will talk about why the Chinese government decided to set up the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, and how it is good in the sense that it is increasing competition with existing multilateral banks, such as the World Bank. But I understand why there has been quite a lot of controversy, given that it is actually filling the gap that is left behind by a lot of the US initiated multilateral organizations. Okay, so let me start by providing a statement made by Napoleon Bonaparte many years ago. He famously said, "Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." How many of you have watched the movie Crazy Rich Asians?
I did.
Okay, so this is actually the beginning scene of that movie. And the director basically just had this exactly to talk about, how the rise of Asia, specifically the rise of China, will surprise the world and may even disrupt the current world order. So we're going to talk about this in the next 20 minutes. The first slide that I want to share with you is basically, this famous graph, or I should say a set of three famous graphs showed in one of the United Nations paper about the decline of the G7 economies, including obviously the United States, Canada, Germany, Australia, Japan, and France, you name it. On the other hand, replacing the economic dominance of the G7 were actually just 7 other emerging economies, which include the 6 countries in the middle that you can see: South Korea, India, Turkey, Indonesia, Thailand, and Poland. And what about the last one in the so-called 7 risers? Well, obviously that was China. You could not put China in the middle graph, because if you put China, you basically see just 6 flat lines in the middle graph. So China has to be put next to the other big economies, which is shown in the third graph. So these 3 graphs show essentially the shares of different economies in global manufacturing output. You may say, well, developed countries become service-oriented, so it is unfair to show the decline in global shares. If I were to replace the first graph by the share of global GDP, you basically see the same trends. The 7 risers are increasing their shares in global GDP, while the G7 is declining in their dominance in global GDP. And of course, the numbers are going to be different, but the trends are going to be exactly the same. Okay. Recently, I invited the Dean of the National University of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, to give a webinar to our participants at the Asia Global Institute. And he became really famous because of this paper that he wrote in 2011. And that was about the global economy's shifting center of gravity. So I'm not going to go to the deep details that he used to construct the so-called economic gravity in the world. But the point is clear that in 1980, the economic center of gravity is basically somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, between obviously Europe and North America. And for the last 30 years, or I should say 40 years now, the center of gravity has been gradually shifting from the Atlantic Ocean towards essentially Beijing. So we all know what is going on because the GDP share of Asian economies have been rising. Relatively speaking, the share of GDP by the United States, including as well as European nations, have been declining. Okay. So what does it mean? It means that China is growing really fast at the rate of 10% for 2 decades and still making to grow at around 6% for the last 10 years. It is currently the second largest economy in the world, as you know. According to the IMF, if you use the purchasing power parity measure, China is already the largest economy. And of course, China has 4 times the population of the United States. So China is still a middle income country. If you look at the GDP per capita, is only around $15,000 per person compared to over $40,000 per person in the United States. But size matters, right? So the sheer size of Chinese economy is increasing, is economic linkages with essentially everybody in the world. If you look at the top #1 trade partner, China is that #1 trade partner of over 100 countries in the world. Used to be the United States 10 years ago, and now China is the most important trade partner of over 100 economies. I'm not sure about how China is being placed for Brazil, but I would be surprised that China is not the top 3 trade partners of Brazil today. As a result, you can look at the trade networks in the world from 1970 all the way to 2012. In 1970, what you see is essentially a US-German-centric global trade networks. Fast forward to 1985, you see that Europe is actually moving away from North America because of closer relationship among European nations, as well as closer relationship between the United States and the rest of the American continent. But what is interesting is that, in 2000, you still don't see China being a major part of the trade networks. Within 12 years, in 2012, China is closely linked to Factory Asia, not surprisingly, including Japan, South Korea, and other Southeast Asian countries, but also to the United States. And on the other hand, there is a separate trade network that is developed in Europe, together with Eastern Europe and also part of Africa. So if anything, the world has become, I would say, fragmented into 2 trade networks in 2012, but not between the US and China. Quite on the contrary, it's actually the US-China-centric trade networks that we have seen in 2012. So the first conclusion that I would like to make at this point is people have been talking about economic decoupling between the 2 superpowers, and I think it is impossible because of the tight economic and financial linkages that have started since 2010. Against the global phenomena that I have discussed just now, there is another worrying phenomena which you are fully aware of, and that is deglobalization. My PhD advisor, Professor Paul Tangs at Harvard, has refused to call this deglobalization. He called this globalization. Whatever terminologies that he likes to pick, I think the graph shows you one very clear fact, and that is since the mid-80s all the way to 2008, we see that global trade in terms of its share in global GDP has been rising at the rate of 7%, okay, per year. What it means is that global GDP has been growing at around 3% per year since the mid-80s. Global export has been growing at around 10%, and therefore you have this net 7% growth in the ratio of export to GDP at the global scale. As we all know, there was a big financial crisis in 2008. There was a big trade collapse in between 2008 and 2009. Trade rebounded in 2010 by almost 10%, but after the quick rebound, we have seen almost no growth in this ratio. Again, the ratio between export and global GDP. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that we are already in almost a decade, more than a decade, I would say, of deglobalization, with continuous global economic growth, but much less export growth. Why is that? I would say there are both structural and policy reasons for deglobalization. Structural reasons include decreasing returns to joining supply chains, and that idea is tightly linked to the use of robots and big data and AI and all sort of automation technologies in factories. So therefore, it is not as profitable and essential for multinational firms to offshore their jobs to developing countries. Now they can do a lot of those jobs in the home countries using robots. The second is, well, the world has become a lot more competitive, so the benefits, or using the economic jargon, the returns to offshoring has declined substantially in the last decade or so. The third reason, which is the second bullet point here, is based on my research with a World Bank economist, Halu He, we found that China is really a big elephant in the room. When he joined the WTO in 2001, there was still a lot of opportunities for countries to participate in global supply chains. But after 2 years of hyperglobalization, because of his active participation in both trade and FDI, there has been less room for other countries and other latecomers to enjoy the growth potential by joining global supply chains. Simply put, there were more trade happening within China rather than trade between China and the rest of the world. And therefore, there is actually less export growth that we can see around the world. The fourth reason is related to global aging. When you're all young, you spend a lot of money on food, on electronic products, on fancy, fashionable products. But when you get old, you spend most of your money on healthcare, on medical services. And when you get really, really old, you spend most of the money on sustaining your life, or hiring nursing staff and taking care of you. So when the world is aging, there's less demand for tradable, consumable products and more demand for domestic services. And that is also a reason for why trade as a share of GDP has been declining since 2008. And obviously, what you have in mind is also relevant, and that is the rise of populism and the changing politics in many countries, both in developing countries and in advanced economies, that are not so friendly to anything global, right? They're not so friendly to immigration, and they're not so friendly to any policies that induce more international trade or foreign direct investment. And the largest event coming out from that changing geopolitical relationships as well as domestic policies, it was obviously the US-China trade war that started in March 2018, as well as Brexit by the United Kingdom in 2017. All right. So one thing that I want to highlight is when we talk about global supply chains, and I still remember the famous economist Richard Owen told me personally over the dinner table, he said the terminology itself is created by sociologists who actually didn't get a chance to look at the data. And he argued global supply chains, first, is not global. Second, it's not about supply. Third, it's not a chain. So the whole term is wrong. So this table by him and one of my students at Johns Hopkins Science, Richard Freeman, who is now working at Bank of England, shows that if you look at the 3 regional trade blocs, including obviously NAFTA, which is now called USMCA, Factory Europe, which is really member countries of European Union, and then Factory Asia, which is composed of Southeast Asian countries together with Japan, South Korea, and China. Trade shares within each regional trade groups have increased over the last 10 years. There's only one exception, which I would call the super connector, and then it's China. China's shares in most of the other countries, imports, as you can see in this red column, has increased over time, especially after the global financial crisis. Okay, so in sum, there's more trade, more connections within each of the 3 trade blocks, but there's one exception, and that is China, that is increasing the linkages between these 3 trade blocks. Other than China, you really don't see quite a lot of other examples increasing the connections between the trade blocks. Okay, and of course, one of the reasons for why the US-China trade war is still going on is very well captured by this wonderful picture. And I think the Chinese politicians and the American politicians are talking about different things. They're playing a different game. My colleague Zhiwu Chen, who's the director of Asia Global Institute, wrote a piece during the trade war in 2018, and he argued even at the professional level, there's no common language. And that is, if you look at the delegation sent by the Chinese government to talk about the trade war, all members in the delegation are economists and financial practitioners. If you look at the US delegation, all of them were lawyers. And we know economists and lawyers don't have a common language. And therefore, they never got to a consensus about how to de-escalate the trade tension between the 2 countries. Well, trade war seemed to be an event that happened a century ago because there was a pandemic that started at the beginning of 2020, which really disrupted the entire world. And I hope you guys are doing okay in Brazil. One thing that is certainly true is before the pandemic, we have seen rising anti-China sentiment in most of the Western democracies. Throughout the almost like 12, 13 months of pandemic, the anti-China sentiment has increased over time. So if you are a politician in any of these countries, you really have no choice, right? Even though deep down you may be more rational about economic relationship with China, or you want to open your arms and welcome more investment and economic engagement from China, you couldn't really do it because the entire population is really having a much more negative feeling about China, and they may not be able to separate China from the Chinese government, not to mention the Communist Party. But that said, there's one sector in the US which I think is a lot more worldly, a lot more rational, or I would say a lot more money-driven, and that is the business sector. In multiple surveys, I'm just picking one of them, and this is like US Commerce and Business Council. They did a survey to the member companies who had businesses in China and asked them whether you are ready to move out from China or about to move out from China, and constantly 88% or above of the surveyed American companies responded by saying they have no plan to leave China, while around 10 to 12% of them said they have plans to move out from China. So you can look at the change and argue, well, Trump did something to the US-China relationship because there was this 2 percentage point increase among the respondents who said they don't find China to be a friendly or profitable market, or they may encounter increasing scrutiny from the Chinese government or rising geopolitical risks because of the deteriorating relationship between US and China. But no one would disagree that the majority of the American businesses still find China to be the market where they can make a lot of money. And as you have heard of the term in China, for China policy, and that is many American businesses, quite on the contrary, because of the rising US-China tension, decided to give up the US market and invest more in China. Later on, I'm going to talk about Elon Musk and his company Tesla, which has set up a gigafactory in Shanghai. And this is just one of the many examples of the so-called in China for China strategy. Is it optimal? I'm not sure, but in this rising uncertain world, I think many companies, if they are still interested in making money in China, they probably will set up more rather than less plans in China. And the reason is they want to avoid all sort of trade frictions due to the geopolitical tension, as well as the rising tariff and non-tariff barriers established by both the Chinese and the US government. Okay, so the unintended consequence, which I have done research on, is US FDI in China has actually increased quite a bit since 2018, especially in high-tech industries. And of course, you cannot blame tariffs entirely for this unintended consequence or surprising change, because the Chinese government strategically also relaxed a lot of the restrictions imposed on FDI before, Trump may be right that the market has been quite closed in certain sectors for U.S. businesses, and now because of the trade war, the Chinese market has become slightly more open, especially in service industries, and as a result, we have seen increase in U.S. FDI in China in the last 2 years. Am I doing all right on time? Because I still have something like 20 slides, and of course I can skip some of them and have conversation with you right away. Cecilia, you have to unmute.
Sorry, I wasn't. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think if you can take 10 more minutes, Heiwai, that would be excellent. I don't know if that will give you time to finish the 20 slides. But,
I can skip a lot of them because I think I already provided the background and already went through some of the main points regarding China and its relationship with the US and other countries.
Yes.
So let me just say very quickly that I remain slightly optimistic about globalization. I think full decoupling is impossible, is irrational, and I still think in most of the Western democracies there are lobbying forces to promote more anti-China policies, but there are also counter-lobbying forces from companies who made a lot of money in China in the last decade or so and continue to do so in the future. So there is some sort of check and balances, you may say, because of the competition between different types of businesses in Europe, in Australia, in Japan even, certainly in the US. So those sort of check and balances will hopefully reduce the threat from nationalism, populism that will continue to increase risks around the world, okay? But the pandemic obviously didn't help. It actually accelerated the deglobalization trends. What we have seen last year was quite an unusual situation in global trade because the majority of emerging markets were still under lockdown, while China, as well as Vietnam, were two of the few emerging markets that emerged from the pandemic. So therefore, you have this sort of quick recovery in global trade, but it's a very asymmetric recovery because of one-way export from Asia to the rest of the world. So the long-term prospects for trade is still very gloomy. And I am more worried about politics, that were affected by the pandemic, obviously, rather than the resilience of supply chains or the rationality of the business sector. So now Biden appeared to be a lot more rational compared to the previous president in the US, and he is obviously a multilateral person. And one thing that he did wisely, together with John Kerry, the previous VP of the US, is not the previous VP, he was the candidate of the US president. But at least one thing that they decided to do is to rejoin the Paris Agreement to work with China on climate change issues. I hope that was a beginning of revived multilateral collaborations, and that will hopefully spill over to other collaboration between the two superpowers. All right, so let's talk about China for around 5 minutes. I'm not sure how much you have heard about this in Brazil. Every 5 years, the Chinese government would meet to talk about the so-called 5-year plan. And the idea is really coming from the socialist Soviet Union. And of course, the Chinese version of 5-year plans are a lot more successful economically compared to the Soviet Union 5-year plans, which obviously failed due to the collapse of the former Soviet Union. In the last 4 or 5-year plans, China had been able to implement the corresponding policies to sustain economic growth and keep inequality on track, I would say. It has been rising quite a lot, which obviously has got the attention of the top leaders in Beijing recently. But I would argue that they are fully aware of the danger of rising inequality, which will create a lot of social economic problems and eventually threaten the stability of the regime. So therefore, in the current 5-year plan, there were 2 sets of policies, in my opinion, that would guarantee inequality to be under control. At the same time, growth will become sustainable. And when we talk about sustainable growth, obviously you can talk about something called the carbon neutral 2060 agenda. And that is the Chinese government is committed to this 40-year plan to reduce carbon emission all the way to 0 by 2060. It's very ambitious, but among the US have a similar plan to reduce carbon emission all the way to 0 by 2050. So China is at least giving itself a 10-year lag to achieve the same goal. But what is new in this 5-year plan compared to all the other 5-year plans we have seen before for China is, first, this is the first time that the Chinese government decided to remove the annual growth target. In the previous 5-year plan, for example, the central government set up annual growth targets of 6%, and they were able to deliver that every year. But this time they decided not to have it, and this is very rational because of the uncertainty after the pandemic, as well as the increasing tension with the United States and other US allies. At the same time, because of the changing global landscape, as well as the uncertainty that everyone is going to see in the next 5 years, China is trying to have a, I would say, stable and safe path to deal with, deglobalization forces, and it may, the deglobalization forces may increase because of the changing politics after the pandemic. So, they started to talk about the so-called dual circulation strategy. And let me talk about the dual circulation strategy for now, and then I can conclude. And that is, there's one part which is about the inner loop or the inner circulation. And the inner circulation itself is composed of 2 parts. One is the government is trying to find ways to increase domestic demand. As of now, I'm going to show you now, the share of consumption in China's GDP is only around 55%, which is less than Switzerland, a country that is famous for saving, and much less compared to other emerging markets like India that has 72% of GDP coming from consumption. And I'm sure much higher share of consumption there. So can you imagine if the Chinese government can do something, for example, by providing a better safety net to reduce saving and increase consumption, a 5% increase in consumption share in GDP is going to provide much more energy for economic growth in China in the next 50 years. So that's part of the inner loop. Another part of the inner loop is really trying to make supply chains in China to be more resilient to external shocks. One good example is obviously about semiconductor supply chains. The sanction imposed by the US government on Huawei, the leading company in China to produce 5G networks and devices, had been completely shut down in that operation because of the shortage of the high-end semiconductors, which are mostly provided by Taiwan. The reason why Taiwan could not export the newest generation of semiconductors to China is because the production of those semiconductors in Taiwan use a lot of the US technologies which have been patented. So the US government had the right to stop the top company in Taiwan called TSMC to export those chips to Huawei, and therefore Huawei has to change its business model and the operation goal, move away from 5G and mobile phones, and now they are talking about producing electric vehicles. Okay, so that's one part about one discussion about the internal circle, and I can talk more during the Q&A if you have more questions. And then about the outside loop, I think the best way to talk about that is really talk about the RCEP, and then I'm going to conclude. So the RCEP, as you may know, is composed of 15 Asia-Pacific economies. This is going to be the largest free trade agreement. People were expecting the full implementation of it at the beginning of next year, and we need around 8 countries to ratify in their own congresses the formation of the free trade agreement. And this 15 member free trade agreement is composed of basically some of the most advanced economies in the world, including Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, and some of the rapidly rising emerging markets in the world, including Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and obviously the largest economy by population in the world, China, and interestingly with Australia and New Zealand as well. So you're really talking about a diverse set of countries, all sharing the same trade networks. But size is not the only sort of attraction of this region. It is also the fastest growing region in the world. As of now, we are talking about 400 million middle class household individuals in China, defined by a household with individuals inside having over $15,000 US income per person. With the same definition, we're talking about 140 million middle class individuals in ASEAN economies, the 10 Southeast Asian economies. And both of these numbers are going to double in the next 10 to 15 years. So you're talking about 1 billion middle class consumers. It's going to be the biggest consumer market in the world. And the member countries are obviously going to benefit from a less frictional trade network. And non-member countries, including the US, will find this region to be the fastest growing market, and they will increase their investment, and they even potentially show interest to join the free trade agreement. So I don't have time to talk about the details, but I think the most attractive part of this free trade agreement is a so-called redefinition of country of origin. The example that I give right now is, suppose you are a factory in Vietnam. Currently, in order to be entitled to any kind of free trade because of bilateral free trade agreement, usually around 40% of the export has to be coming from Vietnam for your product, right? So suppose you're producing a mobile phone, and if the mobile phone has less than 40% Vietnamese content, that is not considered as a made in Vietnam product, and therefore, your trade partner will impose a different tariff because you are not part of the bilateral free trade agreement. And right now, with all these 15 countries in the same RCEP free trade zone, as long as 40% of a tradable product has content coming from any of the 15 member countries, you will be exempted from tariffs within the zone. And of course, it's not going to happen overnight because people expect 5 to 10 years sort of phasing into the free trade scenario. But we're talking about 92% of the currently traded products to be fully exempted from tariffs, and 65% of the services will be fully open to each other among the 15 economies. So this is just one of the examples of how China is thinking about building multilateralism, perhaps without the US or the US allies. And China is very interested in doing that within the neighbor countries. And there are a lot of reasons to argue why China would be choosing to do that. First, those member countries, because of the proximity, have become a lot more dependent on China because of the investment, because of Chinese investment, because of the Belt and Road initiatives, because of a lot of the infrastructure projects that were already started. Second, they also share similar culture. Some of them share similar institutional frameworks, like Singapore, which is always sympathetic to China's economic models. Third is really about the emerging market experiences. They do not think that the Washington consensus or the Western economic models were the best fit for the current situations. They all look at China and realize, well, it was a very poor country just 30 years ago, and now it's a middle income country. So there got to be something that the Chinese government has done right, which can provide some insight and lessons for their own growth and development strategies. Okay, so in this, let me just wrap up by saying, with the formation of the RCEP, with the Belt and Road initiatives, China will become more connected to other Asian economies. As Richard Bowen has said, trade will only become more regionalized, and it has become more regionalized in the last few years because of US-China trade war, and also because of the pandemic. And at the same time, the Chinese government has other initiatives, such as the Belt and Road initiatives, the continuous influence by its own development bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And at the same time, the central government in China has been trying to internationalize its own currency, the RMB. It has not been very successful. Only around 2% of global transactions are being done using RMB. But if you look at trade, China has been making great progress in encouraging other trade partners to use the RMB. If you look at trade that has China on one side of the transaction, around 24% of trade in that categories have been using RMB already. So with the formation of RCEP, we will only see an increasing use of RMB. And China is talking about digital currency already, and we will see more digital trade in the post-pandemic world, and that would also facilitate the increasing use of digital RMB in other countries. I mean, I can talk more, but I think it would be more productive for us to have an open conversation, for your continent or any questions that you have in mind.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Heiwai. That was amazing. I don't know if people can applaud with real applauses or with the reactions, but super informative, an excellent overview of a Chinese economic history, the growth, the amazing progress you've been doing in such a short period of time. I invite every one of you to start writing down any comments or key questions on the chat, so Julia can help us reading them in order in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Perhaps we will not have answers to answer all of them, but at least 2 or 3. I just want to start first sharing, Heiwai, my initial questions to open the conversation. Myself as a sociologist from Latin America, passionate about South-South cooperation, but especially committed to building a world of dignity for all. I mean, as the founder of Global Change and as a change maker, I think as a Latin American, even I'm not Brazilian, I'm Argentinian, and I think all Latin America have this admiration for China's, what China did in terms of poverty reduction. And now you just mentioned the new 5-year plans in terms of tackling inequality. And this is extremely big problem for Latin America. It's the problem now, even now with the pandemic, as you can imagine, poverty is rising to levels of 60% in countries like Argentina that even are big and quite strong, or Brazil. This is having a lot of type of consequences, violence, governance consequences, weakening of our economies and democracies, etc. I'm just wondering if you can say a few words of how you did it, how you managed to, in these 30 years, to take so many people out of poverty, and how you think that now you can tackle inequality, because when I've been in China as an Asia Global Fellow, you also see this huge divide between the rich and and the poor, that obviously is not as poor as it was before, but you can see that it might be also a big problem in the even now or in the near future. So I wonder if you can share with us, as Latin America is really concerned about these issues, how you did it, and what would be your key recommendations as an economist. Thank you.
I would like to talk about a book to sort of wrap our mind around in talking about these two issues. So your question, you have two questions, right? You know, one is how China managed to lift so many people out of poverty in around 3 decades. Basically, it was already achieved, I would say, a few years ago. And second is how it has maintained inequality from, avoid inequality from going too fast, and how it is going to suppress inequality from growing further. So, the book that I would like to mention, which some of you may have heard, is a book called One Economics Many Recipes by Professor Danny Rodri at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he argued that, at the end of the day, we know the major economic models that the Western scholars will teach you. First will be about perfect competition and why market is good and how it is the best mechanism to allocate resources. But on the other hand, the world is full of market failures. A good example is pollution that China has suffered quite a bit in 2000 and onward. And I would say, the Chinese government has done quite a lot to clean up the sky and to restrict factories from continuing to pollute. The kind of economics that we usually talk about to solve market failures is to identify the failures first. Like if you know there's certain kind of factories that are polluting a lot, if you're a Chinese government, which is actually a very authoritative one, then you can just shut it down, which is obviously not the option for many other countries, especially those with democracies. But then a more market-based approach is to increase tax, or at least find ways to increase the cost of production for the polluting industries, right? So that's just one way. And China has done that too, right? So they also raise the tax for certain polluting industries. But I think the world has focused a lot on the negative parts of market failures, which are usually called negative externalities in economics, but not so much on the positive side of market failures, which are also called positive externalities. And in that regard, I think China has been doing much better than most of the emerging markets in the world by providing subsidies, support to activities that can generate positive spillovers to other parts of the economy. A good example is China has identified several strategic high-tech industries to develop, in addition to just basically giving money to universities and companies to invest in R&D and to hire R&D staff. It has a very holistic and comprehensive approach to do that. So I didn't have time, but I was going to talk about electric vehicle. So the EV market is the fastest rising market among all the high-tech industries in China because of the increasing income of the middle class. They have taste about environmental friendly products as well as good products produced by branded companies like Tesla. So what they did, the Chinese government, both in the center as well as in Shanghai, is to find ways to attract Elon Musk to set up the factory. And they are not particularly attracted by Elon Musk, personality and things, right? If anything, I think Elon Musk's personality is a bit risky in the Chinese environment today. But it's actually EV itself and the brand that can sort of the image that can be provided by Tesla. I mean, if you think about that, it really achieves several goals in terms of generating positive externalities to different segments of the economy. First, it enhanced the taste of the Chinese consumers, right? Tesla obviously produced the best EVs. And second, it it shows the commitment of the Chinese government, how open they are. During the US-China trade war, they opened their arms to a US company to invest in China in a very strategic industry. Third, EV is a sector that can generate spillovers along the supply chain, but also horizontally across industries. When it comes to supply chain spillovers, think about EV. What is the most important of in the production of EV? It's the production of the battery. So you think about battery, it requires technology, R&D, but also the discovery of new materials or new chemicals. For now, lithium is the most important chemical used in battery. Both Elon Musk and the Chinese government realized lithium is like the new petroleum. There's one day that lithium will be totally gone, and both the Chinese EV sector and Tesla will be done, right? If they don't have access to lithium, they cannot make the cars. So both Tesla and Chinese government are spending a lot of money to produce the new substitute for lithium, right? So there's one example of how just by developing the EV markets can provide stimulus and spillover to the upstream sectors, to the R&D activities. And of course, I can go on, right? There's also the downstream to allow more marketing activities and the emphasis on IP protection and things like that.
That's super useful. Thank you so much. I tried to summarize some of your points in the chat, but of course, if you want to send, besides your amazing presentation, if you have any recommendations for reading in terms of your preferred article or short article describing some of these issues, that would be extremely interesting. I'm going to move now to the first question. Follow the work of Mr. Tan. I think you can say, Heiwai, how people can contact you, but I guess they can find you on LinkedIn if they want. Then Victor is asking, what roles can the Brazilian foreign policy have as a member of a new development bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and in the reformulation of a new world order? You have had some experience also working with these regional banks and the BRICS banks, so I wonder what you can say about that, if you have any opinion.
I think the world has become fragmented, more fragmented after the pandemic, and politicians in the West have been more hawkish towards China, and this is a political reality, right? I have no value judgment about whether they should or should not do it. So as a result, for emerging markets like Brazil, they have to be very strategic in leveraging in China, but also diversifying risks in the right way, right? Suppose you are talking about companies, they probably should have two set of suppliers and buyers in two different markets, right? One is sort of China centric markets, the other one is like the US or North American market, right? So that's more about the corporate strategy. But in terms of the government, they also have to realize that this is what the businesses are going to do in the best response, to this sort of changing relationship between the two superpowers. And I guess you look at countries like Japan, or even better, South Korea. They have been playing the diversifying game very well. They joined both the RCEP, which is obviously China dominated, as well as the CPTPP, which is Japan dominated, with the possibility that the US will become a new member in the Biden. So for the Brazilian government this is a lesson for the Brazilian government, with my humble opinion, and that is what South Korea is doing is probably the constraint optimal strategy, right? I guess the world is more divided. There's not a lot of choices, but diversification is the key for businesses, for the government, and there's nothing prohibiting major countries' government to join both clubs. And why not, right? The US not joining the AIIB is for political reason, but there are still a lot of room for other countries' members to join. And I don't think this is like, because a lot of other countries are doing that. I don't see this as a political liability, or there should not be any concern about pissing off the other side too much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We need to be very, very intelligent and very, very careful as well in this moment of relationship building between Brazil and Latin America and China and the US. The second question is more about technology, and it's from Pedro. Pedro said, you talk of the shift in the economy center of gravity, but focusing on technology. And he would like to understand, from your point of view, the importance of e-commerce, apps like Alipay, and the 5G technology for this to happen. So what's the role of technology and e-commerce in that shift in the gravity of power?
That's an excellent question. I would like to talk about other kind of influence China has had on other countries, but in the interest of time, I can only show one graph drawn by Danny Kwa, the Dean of NUS Policy School. But more important, in my opinion, than economic gravity is, I think, soft power gravity, or I may even say political gravity. And it has been shifting together with the economic gravity. One concern that the US government and some of its allies have is the Belt and Road Initiative. It is increasing the economic linkages between the member countries and China. But through those infrastructure projects and collaborations, China is perhaps indirectly, not intentionally, but indirectly influencing other governments to follow their business models or their governance structure. One good example is public-private partnership, which has been in the DNA of China's economic model. So other countries now learn that, well, there are actually room or I should say better balance between the government and the private sector. Perhaps they had a different balance before, and now they are sort of shifting closer to China's way of governing economy. Another influence that we had related to this question is the use of technology, and especially digital technology, in growing the economy, especially during the pandemic, right? So China suffered relatively less during the pandemic, partly because of the draconian approach to control the movement of the people, but partly because of the better use of digital technologies, including big data and AI. So other countries realize, well, there are huge social benefits of adopting those technologies, but they also realize that they may not have the same governance structure or capacity to do the same, partly because of the respect for data privacy and things like that. And they also realize that, well, e-commerce is connecting buyers and suppliers more efficiently in China before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic. So other emerging markets, which obviously have the same kind of challenges, developing the rural area or lifting poor people out from poverty, we realize the e-commerce strategy could be a potential way to get things done. And obviously they will turn to China for help, and some emerging markets already welcome of Alibaba trade networks together with the e-payment system. And all of these are just, opinion, sort of, creating a new path for China to increase the use of digital R&D in those countries as well. But that is a different topic, which I elaborate on if there are follow-up questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That's very useful. Heiwai, can you come a little bit closer to the mic? Because sometimes when you move, we lose some of your words.
Okay, sorry. Did it happen during my presentation?
No, not so much, but sometimes it happens. But no, don't worry. But
Okay,
we were
maybe
able to hear, but sometimes some words were missing.
Okay.
Perhaps just in the last couple of minutes, because we close, everyone has to go to another class. I just try to condense two questions and just give us, please, your final thoughts. There is one question from Victor in terms of what's China, let me see, what are China plans for relationship with South America? You mentioned that you don't know much about that, so don't worry if you don't know. And in particular of student exchange or transfer of technology. If you know anything, but if you don't worry, because we will have someone dedicated to South America and China relations on Friday. And then the final question is, what do you think of China's support to the ASEAN and how this could improve with the Mercosur? I mean, if you have any final thoughts or recommendations in general on China, Latin American relations, even knowing that we are very far away and that, as you mentioned, we are not strategically or necessarily in this regional landscape, that it seems to be becoming more and more important, no? So any final thoughts about that?
So I have done some work in the past looking at the relationship between China and individual African countries. And obviously, those lessons may not be directly applicable to understand the relationship between Latin America and China, but I see potential similarities. So first of all, China is looking at natural resources in some African nations. But increasingly, China is looking at manufacturing partnerships with some of the more industrialized economies like Ghana and obviously South Africa, Nigeria, etc. So the economic engagement of China in Latin America is less compared to its engagement in Africa, but the patterns are probably quite similar, right? If you have some of the more natural resource-based economies, China will be investing a lot because of those advantages. But in the relatively more developed or more industrialized economies, China will start to offshore some of the manufacturing jobs. And don't forget, everyone is diversifying in this post-pandemic, more uncertain global economy. So in fact, I know some of the Chinese companies are setting up their plants in Latin America to serve the customers there, but at the same time, try to sell to the American and Canadian customers, right? So there's some sort of diversification and restructuring of supply chains that would potentially affect positively the region, your region as well. So lastly, regarding the question about ASEAN, China is already signing bilateral free trade agreement with every single ASEAN country. But with the formation of the RCEP, there will be a more unified, more harmonious trade and financial networks in the region. And whenever we talk about free trade agreement, we know there will be trade diversion. So it will be bad news for some of the countries that are not within the network. I would say India will potentially get some of the trade being diverted away to the 15 countries in the free trade agreement. So what would happen to other countries? Well, I guess they will have to consider whether to join the free trade agreement. And when we have a lot of these FTAs, we are essentially gradually moving back to the WTO, which may not be a bad thing because we know that the WTO has not been as effective as before. So I hope that the trade diversion created by multiple regional trade agreements will finally lead to more incentives for different free trade agreements to be combined into a more global one. But that would probably be too optimistic given today's situation. But in 10 years, who knows, right? Maybe we are in a better world.
Excellent. So it's a time of creativity also, and looking for new spaces and opportunities, especially for us that in Latin America we really need to diversify. We really need to get better at connecting and finding the niche and what we can offer. In my opinion, hopefully not only inclined to natural resources extraction, because this is also what has kept us, low down in the grade of development. But I hope we can find complementarities and eventually have more dialogue and exchanges and trade and commerce with China, with you. So Heiwai, I really appreciate all your presentation and your answers. I hope that is the first opportunity to exchange with you, with the Asia Global Institute, and with Iri Puki, with Global Change, with other Latin American partners. There is a lot to do in terms of building partnerships, mutual understanding, getting to know each other. For your information, the reputation of China in Latin America is one of the most positive. Perhaps that's changing now in the pandemic. There are new research being underway, but in the most recent pre-pandemic, it was perhaps one of the regions in the world with better, really being positive about the role of China in the world. So I hope that doesn't change and we can create more opportunities for dialogue. So I thank you for your LinkedIn. And we see each other another time. Thank you everybody for staying, and talk soon. See you tomorrow. Thank you, Heiwai.
Look forward to more collaboration in the future.
Thank you so much. Let's go. So more exchanges and fellows. See you soon then. See you tomorrow. Thank you, Heiwai. Let's talk soon.